Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 6 of his work Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes is not only going to outline and show us how these, what he calls, 6 simple passions arise. These are very general, we could say, emotional or affective attitudes, even practical attitudes towards things. But then they're going to become diversified in a number of different ways. And he's going to bring us back in the chapter to thinking about one really important crux of this, what he calls deliberation, and then he's going to talk a bit about language, something he's very interested in. So let's talk about these 6 simple passions. Earlier in the chapter, he has outlined how it is that desire and aversion, love and hate, joy and grief have arisen within the human being, and not only the human being, but other animal life as well. And these are very general. He also uses the word appetite, but appetite is essentially the same here as desire, as we've seen earlier. So this is a very common approach to the human emotions to distinguish general categories, which then are going to, as he's going to say, these are names for diverse considerations, diversified. So they have different considerations or different viewpoints, we could say, and then they wind up going in a whole bunch of other directions, but they're all ultimately going to be reducible to these 6. And other philosophers have different numbers and sets of basic emotions. The Stoics, for example, who were quite influential, not just on their own school, but other later authors, for example, Augustine, will distinguish 4 main categories of emotion. Others will have more, others will have less. So Hobbes has these 6. And how are they diversified? So he's going to lay out 4 different ways in which this takes place. The first is the opinion that the person who's feeling it, or we say is feeling it, has of the likelihood of attaining what it is that they desire. So, obviously that applies to desire and aversion. Aversion is a desire not to have something, not to fall into something. Could also potentially have to do with joy and grief or love and hate, but not quite so much. Then we have one that pertains very clearly to love and hate, the object that is either loved or hated, that we view as good or view as bad. Then we can also have the consideration, as he's going to say, of many passions together. So, and they don't actually have to be many. It suffices to have 2 passions at the same time that are combining in a certain way to produce a distinct emotional state. And then finally, alteration or succession itself. We go from feeling one thing to feeling another. There can be a name for that overarching going from one to the other. And as we're going to see, deliberation really figures into this. But we're going to put that off for a moment. And let's go very, very briefly through the different ones that he talks about. Some of these are perhaps more reasonable or commonsensical than others. There may be a few where you're like, yeah, I'm not really sure about this. But it gives you an idea of what he's talking about. So he tells us appetite or desire with an opinion of attaining, hope, right? We hope because we think we actually have some possibility. The same without such opinion, despair. So desire, depending on whether we think we can get the thing that we want, could go one way, could go another way. He goes on again, the same, or aversion without opinion of hurt from, with opinion of hurt from the object is fear. We fear things that we think are going to hurt us, that we don't like. The same with hope of avoiding that hurt by resistance, courage. So courage is viewed as a passion here. Sudden courage is anger. Okay, that's, a little bit trickier. We might agree with that, we might not. Constant hope is confidence of ourselves. Constant despair, diffidence of ourselves. Anger for great hurt done to another when we conceive the same to be done by injury. Indignation. So he's making a distinction here between indignation as a specific kind of anger and then anger larger. Desire of good to another, benevolence, goodwill. If to man generally, good nature. Desire of riches, covetousness. Right? And then he says, desire of office or precedence, ambition. And he says, by the way, these are always looked at in the worst sense. We don't have to do that. Desire of things that conduce but a little to our ends and fear of things that are but of little hindrance. Pusillanimity. Kind of a tricky word to wrap our heads around, right? And it's not a word that we use much these days, but that's like the opposite of, being bold or confident. As we say, sweating the small stuff, right? Now we get to contempt. Remember that, now this is interesting, right? Because he's talked about these 6 simple passions, but we did have love, hate, and contempt. So maybe that is another one. Contempt of little helps and hindrances. Magnanimity, great souledness, right? Magnanimity in danger of death or wounds is valor or fortitude in use of riches, liberality. The opposite, pusillanimity in the same as wretchedness or miserableness or parsimony. Love of persons for society, kindness. Love of persons for pleasing the sense only, natural lust when we want to get it on with somebody, right? Love of the same, pleasing the sense only. Acquired from rumination, that is imagination of pleasure past, luxury. Not a term we use all that much in this sense. Love of one singularly with desire to be singularly beloved, the passion of love, right? So attraction to another person. The same with fear that the love is not mutual, jealousy. Desire by doing hurt to another to make him condemn some fact of his own, revengefulness, right? Desire to know why and how, curiosity. And he says, by the way, this is something that is, much more a matter of us than other animals. Fear of power invisible, feigned by the mind or imagined from tales. Religion, not allowed. Superstition, when the power imagined is truly as we imagine true religion. Fear without the apprehension of why or what is panic, terror. Joy from the apprehension of novelty, admiration, proper to the human being. Joy arising from imagination of a man's own power and ability is glorying, right? It can be vainglory, it can be confidence. Grief from opinion of want of power is called dejection of mind. The vainglory which consists in the feigning or supposing of abilities in ourself, he says, which we know are not, is most incident to young men. Then he goes on and talks about sudden glory, the passion which makes those grimaces called laughter. Now we're getting more into behavior, right? Laughter is a grimace, according to Hobbes. And he says that a lot of laughter can be a sign of the kind of person. On the contrary, what's the opposite of laughing? Weeping. Sudden dejection, the passion that causes weeping. Grief for the discovery of some defect of ability is shame, right? The contempt of good reputation, impudence. Grief for the calamity of another, pity. And we can call this compassion, as well as fellow feeling. Contempt or little sense of the calamity of others, cruelty. right? Grief for the success of a competitor in wealth, honor, or good. If it's joined with endeavor to enforce our own abilities to equal or exceed him, is called emulation. Joined with endeavor to supplant or hinder a competitor, envy. So notice emulation and envy, it really depends on what we're doing with it. So he goes on, and he's going to say, all right, we've got all of these different passions, some of which, as we've seen, are emotional states, some of which are more responses, laughing and crying. And what happens when they succeed each other? Because we're constantly thinking and feeling something. So he says, when in the mind of a human being, appetites and aversions, hopes and fears concerning one and the same thing arise alternately, and diverse good and evil consequences of the doing or omitting the thing propounded come successfully into our thoughts, so that sometimes we have an appetite to it, sometimes an aversion, sometimes hope, sometimes despair, fear. The whole sum of desires, aversions, hopes, and fears continued until the thing be either done or thought impossible is what we call deliberation. So our process of thinking things through, deciding what we're going to do, whether it's something as trivial as, what kind of toppings should we put on the pizza, or big things like, how should I run my life, These are things that we can deliberate about. And as he's going to point out, this is for things that a person considers possible. You don't deliberate about things that you consider impossible. You may arrive at the point of realizing something is impossible, then you stop deliberating. But we don't deliberate about complete impossibilities. So things that are totally outside of our scope, we might say, we might deliberate about whether somebody else might do something, but it's not deliberation in the same sense that Hobbes is talking about here. So that's important. He also says that, we are not unique as human beings in carrying out deliberation. Says this alternate succession of appetites, aversions, hopes, and fears is no less in other living creatures than in human beings. Therefore, beasts also deliberate. And you can see this, offer your dog a challenging situation or your cat or whatever, and it will kind of waver, right? And then it decides on something. It's finished deliberating. So Hobbes is going to say that the last desire or aversion, the thing that actually decides what our action or response is going to be what we call the will. And he says that this is the act, not the faculty of willing. So this also means that other animals have a will, and he's going to criticize the Aristotelians, the schools. He's going to say their definition of will is rational appetite. Not a very good one because it doesn't capture what the will does. He says if it were rational appetite, then there couldn't be any voluntary act against reason. But we do know that we do, in fact, engage in things that are unreasonable. We would probably just look at our own day-to-day experience and find a few cases, unless you're very, very rational and squared away and consistent with that. So what this is going to lead him to saying is that really all of our actions that derive from any sort of passions, that have their beginnings in passions, are actually going to be voluntary. So voluntary, maybe not in the sense that given that passion we could resist it and do otherwise, but voluntary in the sense that we're responsible for it because it's our will that has chosen that particular action or a response, right? So he goes on and he says that will is just the last appetite in deliberating, and it's manifest that not only actions that have their beginnings from covetousness, ambition, lust, or other appetites, but also those that have to do with aversion or fear. These are also voluntary. And why does he bring that up? Because sometimes people will say, oh, well, I didn't really choose it. It wasn't voluntary. I was afraid for my life. And Hobbes would come along and say, man, that's just as voluntary as what you wanted to do. It's all voluntary in that respect. Then he moves on to talking about language. So we come back to all these different passions, and he says that they involve, when we're expressing them, different ways of talking. So some of them are expressed, as he says, indicatively. That is, we declare them, right? We say, I love, I fear, I joy, I deliberate, I will, I command. Others, however, are not affirmations unless they serve to make other inferences besides that of the passion they proceed from. So deliberation, he says, is expressed subjunctively. Not a concept that we use in English all that much these days, but what subjunctive means, so here's an example, if this be done, then this will follow, right? The language of desire and aversion, he says, is imperative. We say, do this, don't do this. We might be saying that to ourselves, right? When the party is obliged to do it, it's command, otherwise prayer or counsel. And he'll talk about the difference between those a bit later in the work. Then he says the language of vainglory or of indignation, pity, and revengefulness, optative, right? So it's a weaker form, kind of like the subjunctive, but more just expressing a will. And then he says the desire to know, there's a peculiar expression called interrogative. When we're curious about something, well, we say, oh, what's the deal here? That's a question. And then finally he says, other languages of the passion I find none. Why? Because cursing, swearing, reviling, and the like aren't signifying as speech, but the actions of a tongue accustomed. So, I don't know. Maybe we should think of cursing and swearing as a distinctive kind of use of language. Hobbes doesn't think so. The last thing that he brings up that I think is really interesting here and is typical of Hobbes is he's going to say that the best that we can hope for in this life, felicity, happiness, is continual success in obtaining the things which a person from time to time desires. So there is no, as he says, perpetual tranquility of mind while we live here. Why? Because life itself is motion and can never be without desire, nor without fear, no more than without sense. Is it possible then in a future afterlife we could enjoy a complete tranquility? Hobbes says, that seems incomprehensible. We don't know what kind of happiness or felicity God has ordained to people who honor him. And he says that's as incomprehensible as the beatific vision that the schoolmen talk about is. So we have to focus on this life. And while in this life, we have these basic passions, and they're continually being provoked in us. And they're leading to all of these other more specific passions, which alternate with each other, lead ultimately to us making decisions by deliberation and the action, and then everything goes back into the hopper again, and we feel more stuff. And this is what our lives and everybody else's are like.